Hashtag my wife packed her bags for another man. My one calm sentence made her freeze. Then she realized she'd lost it all. The night my marriage ended, Claire packed a suitcase on the edge of our bed and told me she was leaving me for another man. She didn't shout it. She didn't cry. She folded a gray sweater into a neat square, set it into the open case, and said it the way a person reads a weather report. Flat, rehearsed, already decided somewhere far away from me. 8 years of marriage, and she delivered the end of it in the same tone she used to tell me we were out of coffee. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom in that quiet house outside Columbus and watched her hands move. That was the strange part. Not the words. The hands. They didn't shake. She had practiced this in her head so many times that the muscles already knew the choreography. And I remember thinking, with a calm that surprised even me, that a person doesn't fold clothes that steadily unless they've been rehearsing the leaving for a very long time. But I need to go back, because the suitcase wasn't the beginning. The beginning was a valet ticket. For months before that night, I found a parking stub in the pocket of Claire's winter coat while I was gathering things for the dry cleaner. It was from a hotel on the north side of the city, the Ashford, a place neither of us had any reason to be. The date stamped on it was a Tuesday she had told me she'd worked late at the office, buried under quarterly numbers. I remember turning that little cardboard rectangle over in my fingers in our kitchen, feeling the first cold thread of something I didn't want to name. When I asked her about it, careful, casual, she didn't even blink. She said a client dinner had run long, that the pharmaceutical company covered valet at that hotel for out-of-town reps, that she'd tossed the stub in her pocket meaning to expense it and forgotten. It was smooth. It was reasonable. It was the kind of answer that closes a door before you realize you were standing in it. And because I loved her, and because a man will lie to himself far longer than a stranger will lie to him, I put the ticket in the trash and let it go. That was my mistake. Not trusting her. Trusting her over the evidence in my own hand. Claire and I had built what looked, from the outside, like a good life. I ran a small structural engineering firm I'd started from nothing, 3 employees, then 8, then a real office with my name on the glass. She was a regional pharmaceutical sales rep, sharp and charming, the kind of person clients remembered. We had the brick house with the big maple in the yard, the 2 cars, the vacations we photographed and posted and half forgot. And somewhere in the middle of all that building, we had quietly stopped being partners and started being roommates who shared a mortgage and a last name. I told myself it was a phase. Every marriage has winters, I thought. I didn't understand yet that some winters are just the season before someone leaves. Once I let the valet ticket go, though, my mind refused to fully let it go. It sat in the back of my head like a splinter. And splinters have a way of drawing your attention to everything around them. So I started noticing. Not spying, noticing. There is a difference, and I clung to it like a man clinging to his own decency. I noticed she joined a gym across town, one nowhere near our house or her office, and that she went at odd hours, coming home with damp hair but no gym bag. I noticed a new wardrobe appearing piece by piece. Sharper, younger, chosen for someone whose eyes I couldn't picture. I noticed her phone. For 8 years it had lived face up on every surface, and then, all at once, it lived face down, and the passcode I'd known for years stopped working, and she carried it into the bathroom the way you'd carry a wallet through a bad neighborhood. I noticed the regional training weekends that had never existed before, the overtime that never showed up on any pay stub, the way she started keeping her car keys in her hand during phone calls like she might need to walk out the door mid-sentence. Each thing on its own was nothing. A gym, a phone, a busy quarter. That's how it works. Betrayal doesn't arrive as one loud fact. It arrives as 100 small ones, each easy to explain, each easy to forgive, until you look up one day and realize the person across the table has built an entire second life in the gaps of the first. I saw the flags. I just kept telling myself they were coincidences, because the alternative meant my whole life was a stage set. Then came the summit that undid all of it. Claire told me she'd be in Chicago for 3 days for a national sales summit, the big one, she said, the one where regional reps got recognized. She packed carefully. She kissed my cheek at the door. She was gone. And that weekend, I ran into Tom at the big hardware store off the highway, filling my cart with lumber for a deck I'd never actually finish. Tom worked at Claire's company. We'd known each other casually for years, cookouts, and Christmas parties. We stood in the paint aisle and talked for 10 minutes about nothing. And then, offhand, laughing, he said the strangest thing. He said he'd just gotten back from the Chicago summit and was surprised Claire had skipped it. Said everyone had asked where she was. Said she'd never even registered. He didn't know what he'd handed me. He was just making conversation. But I stood there in that fluorescent aisle with a 2x4 in my hand and felt the floor tilt, because my wife was supposedly in Chicago at that exact moment, at a conference she had never signed up for. That was the day I stopped noticing and started knowing. I didn't rage. I didn't call her screaming. Rage is loud, and loud people make mistakes, and I had decided, right there among the paint cans, that I would not be the one who made the mistakes this time. I went home. I sat at my kitchen table, and I started, quietly and methodically, pulling on every thread she'd left loose. I went back through months of the shared credit card, the one she thought I never looked at. I found the pattern hiding in plain sight, the same restaurants, the same hotel, the Ashford again and again, always on the nights she'd claimed to be somewhere else. I found charges for 2 of everything. I found a name that kept surfacing at the edges of it all. A name I'd heard her mention exactly twice and dismissed both times. Brett, her new regional director. The man who signed off on her territory, her bonuses, her schedule. The man who had every professional reason to travel with her and every convenient excuse to never be questioned. And on one gray Thursday, when she told me she had a late client dinner, I did the only thing I am not proud of in this entire story. I drove to the Ashford. I parked across the lot. And I waited. I told myself I'd leave the second I felt ashamed, but shame never came, because what came first was Claire, stepping out of a car that wasn't hers, laughing up at a tall man in a good coat, letting him rest his hand on the small of her back the way I hadn't been allowed to in over a year. I only needed to see it once. Some images print themselves permanently. I put the car in reverse and drove home, and I didn't feel like a man who had caught his wife. I felt like a man who had finally stopped lying to himself. Here is what she never understood about me. Most people in that moment would have driven straight home and torn the house apart with the truth. I didn't, because I had learned, running a business, that the person who reacts first loses. The person who prepares wins. So I said nothing. For 3 weeks I said nothing. I looked into her eyes across the dinner table and I said nothing, while underneath that silence I was building the only kind of response that would matter. I found a divorce attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Diane Alvarez, and I sat in her office and laid the whole thing out. She told me infidelity alone wouldn't move the needle much in our state, but preparation would. Documentation, clean financials, no surprises. So I built the file. I moved my half of our joint savings into a separate account, legally, transparently, on the record. I pulled together the paperwork on the house, which I had partly bought with an inheritance from my father before we married and had, on my dad's old lawyer's advice, always kept titled carefully as separate property. And I pulled the oldest file of all, the one Claire had spent 8 years hoping I'd forget. Because when I met Claire, she wasn't the polished woman clients remembered. She was drowning. A little event planning business she'd started had collapsed and left her with almost $40,000 in debt. Collectors calling, her credit in ruins. Her parents never told a word of it. I paid it down, quietly, over the first 2 years of our marriage, without ever once holding it over her head. Nobody knew. Not her parents. Not her friends. And now I was certain not Brett. That debt, and the man who'd erased it, were the foundation her new confident life stood on, and she had walked off that foundation without ever telling the new man it existed. 3 weeks after the hardware store, Diane's office had a complete separation agreement ready. I took a copy, I slid it into a plain envelope, and I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. I didn't know exactly when Claire would make her move. I only knew that when she did, I would not be the one caught off guard. I would be the one who'd been ready for months. She made her move on a Sunday evening with the suitcase. So there we were, her folding clothes with those steady, rehearsed hands. Me in the doorway. She told me she was moving in with Brett. She told me they'd fallen in love, that she couldn't keep pretending, that she deserved to be happy. When I asked how long, she looked annoyed that I'd even want to know, and then, almost defiant, she said 8 months. 8 months. I remember doing the arithmetic in my head. 8 months of Tuesdays, of summits that didn't exist, of a hand on her back in a hotel lot, and understanding fully that nobody betrays a person for 8 months by accident. 8 months isn't a slip. It's a decision made new every single morning, again and again, 300 times over. She waited for the explosion. I could see it in the way her shoulders were already braced. She had scripted this fight down to the last line, and every line of hers depended on a line from me. The shouting, the begging, the wounded husband she could point to later and call unstable, so that the story she'd tell Brett and her friends would have a villain who wasn't her. I didn't give it to her, and that unsettled her more than any scream could have. She stopped folding. She asked, sharp, whether that was really all I had to say. And I said the one sentence I'd been carrying, quiet as a closing door. I told her that she hadn't taken anything from me tonight, that I'd lost the marriage months ago, the night I sat in a parking lot across from the Ashford and watched her let another man touch her, and that I'd already grieved it, already made my peace with it, weeks before she ever unzipped that suitcase. She froze. Her hands stopped completely. For the first time all evening, the choreography failed her, because the whole performance had assumed I was learning this now. She'd walked in believing she was the one delivering the news. In one sentence she understood she was months behind me. Her face did something I'd never seen it do. It recalculated, live in real time, the certainty draining out of it like water out of a cracked glass. She asked, and her voice had lost its edge, whether I had spied on her. I told her the truth. I told her I'd only had to look once, and that a marriage a man has to surveil is already over. Then I reached into my jacket and set the envelope on the dresser beside her suitcase. She stared at it like it might bite. When she asked what it was, I told her. A separation agreement, drawn up by my attorney, ready to sign. The color left her face. She asked, almost whispering, whether I'd really had lawyers involved this whole time, and I told her I'd been meeting with Diane for weeks, that I hadn't planned this, I'd prepared for it, and that those are very different things. Planning means you hope it happens. Preparing means you're simply not destroyed if it does. She opened the envelope with hands that finally, at last, were not steady. She flipped through the pages. She got to the financial disclosures and I watched her find it, the joint savings already split, already moved, months ago. She looked up at me and asked how long ago I'd done that, and when I told her, the number landed on her like a weight. 3 months. It meant I had known before she thought I could have known. It meant every confident evening she'd spent lying to me, I had spent quietly getting ready. Then she found the house. And her mouth opened and nothing came out, because there in black and white was the paperwork showing it had been mine before her. Kept separate the whole time, the one asset she'd assumed she was walking away with half of. She had built her exit around numbers that no longer existed. She looked at those pages for a long time. And then, in the smallest voice I'd heard from her in years, she said that Brett didn't know about the old debt. The 40,000, the collapse, the 2 years I'd spent digging her out. It wasn't a question. It was fear spoken out loud. She was afraid I'd tell him. I told her I didn't need to. I told her, gently, almost kindly, that reality would tell him for me. Because a fantasy runs on stolen weekends and hotel lobbies, but a life runs on bills and disclosures and the 1,000 small truths a person can't hide once they actually live together. Everything she'd hidden from Brett, he was about to inherit in full. I wasn't going to expose her. I was just going to step out of the way and let the truth catch up on its own schedule. For one last moment she tried the only move she had left. She said quietly that maybe we were moving too fast. The first retreat. The first crack. The first sign that the future she'd been so sure of had started to look thin and cold now that she could see all of it. I picked up my jacket. I told her she hadn't thought we were moving too fast during 8 months of lying. And then I left her there, her and the suitcase, and the envelope, and the version of the evening she'd never once imagined. 3 weeks later she was gone for real. No screaming match, no scene in the driveway. She moved her things out while I was at the office, left her house key in the center of the kitchen counter like a period at the end of a sentence, and moved into Brett's apartment across the city. The divorce was already rolling by then. Diane told me Claire was contesting a few items, but that most of it was just stalling, and I told her to keep moving. I wasn't after revenge. I was after finished. And a strange thing happened while Claire went off to build her new life. I got mine back. I started going to the gym again, my gym, the ordinary one near the house. I called old friends I'd let drift and found they'd been waiting for me the whole time. I took weekend trips and asked no one's permission. My firm, freed from the low background hum of a marriage quietly dying, had its best year in a decade. And the feeling that surprised me most wasn't happiness. Exactly. It was quiet. For over a year I'd been carrying a suspicion I couldn't set down, and now I'd set it down, and the silence where it used to be felt like a room with the windows finally open. Then the reports started drifting back to me, the way they always do in a city that's really just a lot of small towns stacked together. Tom told me over coffee that he'd seen Claire and Brett arguing in a parking lot, and that she hadn't looked good. Not tired, he said, but hollow. Someone else mentioned Brett leaving a restaurant alone after what looked like a fight. Someone from her company let slip that there'd been trouble at work, that when the relationship between a rep and her regional director came to light, HR had not looked kindly on it, that a manager and a subordinate carrying on had violated a policy she'd apparently forgotten existed. Her territory got reassigned. Her bonuses got frozen pending review. The very man she'd chosen for the life he could give her had become the reason that life was quietly falling apart. Reality, right on schedule, had started collecting its debt. I didn't celebrate. Celebrating would have meant I was still keeping score, and I'd stopped keeping score the night I walked out of that bedroom. 2 months on, with the divorce entering its final stretch, my phone rang from a number I didn't know. I almost let it go. I answered, and a man's voice came through, careful and tired, and asked if this was Paul. When I said it was, there was a long pause, and then he told me his name was Brett, and that he thought we needed to talk. I'll admit I was curious. Men like Brett don't usually make that call, which meant something in his world had cracked badly enough to override his pride. We met at a coffee shop near my office. He looked nothing like the confident man from the hotel lot. He looked worn down, uncertain, like someone who'd woken up in a house he didn't recognize. And slowly, awkwardly, he told me why he'd come. He said Claire hadn't been honest with him. He said she'd told him our marriage had basically been over for years before he ever came into it, that I was cold and absent, that she was practically already single. And then, he said, he'd started finding out other things. The debts she'd never mentioned, the money troubles, the arguments she swore had never happened. He'd built his whole choice on a story, and the story was coming apart in his hands. He looked up at me and said, half ashamed, that he was starting to think he'd been played too. And here is the honest truth. For a second, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost, but not quite. Because whatever lies Claire had told him, he had still knowingly gotten involved with a married woman, had still let his hand rest on my wife's back in a parking lot, and no amount of being deceived changes what you choose to do with the truth you did have. I told him I didn't know what he wanted from me. He said he didn't want anything. So I told him we were done, and I stood up and left him with his coffee. Whatever he and Claire had built, they were going to have to live inside it. That was never going to be my house to fix. 3 days after that, the last person reached out. A single line from Claire. Asterisk, can we talk? Please? Asterisk, I set the phone down and didn't answer. An hour later, another. Asterisk, I'm not asking for anything. I just need to talk to you. Asterisk, and I knew, the way you know these things, that a person who insists they're not asking for anything is always asking for something. I told her 1 meeting, a public place, 30 minutes, no more. She agreed before I'd even finished. She was already at the cafe when I got there, at a table by the window, and she looked nothing like the woman who had folded that sweater with such steady hands. That certainty was gone. She looked exhausted all the way through, the way a person looks when the story they told themselves has finally collapsed on top of them. She told me things hadn't gone the way she'd expected, that she and Brett fought constantly, that he'd accused her of not being honest. And when I asked if she had been, she couldn't hold my eyes, which was answer enough. And then she told me the thing that closed the whole circle. Brett had met someone else. He was already halfway out the door. The man she'd blown up her marriage to be with had done to her exactly what she'd done with him, and the irony sat between us on that little table, and neither of us had to say a word about it. She said she'd made a mistake. She said she'd changed. And I believed her. That's the part that surprised her, I think, that I didn't argue. I told her I believed she'd changed. Then she asked the question she'd built the whole meeting around, the one she'd been walking towards since before I sat down. Whether there was any chance for us. I looked at her for a long moment, and I told her no. Not out of cruelty. Not out of triumph. I told her the truth, which was simpler and heavier than either. That she was right, she had changed, but so had I. While she'd been losing the fantasy she chased, I had quietly built a life that no longer had a door she could walk back through. That was the part she'd never accounted for. She'd assumed I would stay frozen exactly where she left me. Waiting, unchanged. A place she could return to if the new life failed. But people aren't rooms you can leave and come back to. The tears finally came, quiet ones, and I didn't reach across the table, because reaching across the table would have been a lie. I stood. I told her she'd made her choice the night she packed that suitcase, and I told her I'd made mine. Then I walked out, and this time neither of us tried to stop the other. The divorce finished 6 months later. The papers came on an ordinary Thursday morning. I signed them at my kitchen table, sent them back to Diane, and went to work. That was it. 8 years reduced to a stack of pages and a few signatures. I'd always imagined closure would arrive as some enormous, cinematic moment. A door slamming, a storm breaking. Didn't. It arrived as a Thursday. Completed form. A closed chapter. Life just quietly went on. Better than it had in years. One night, months after driving home, I passed the Ashford. Same building. Same lit-up sign. The place where, in a parking lot, I'd stopped being married in every way that mattered long before Claire ever said the words. And I felt, to my own surprise, almost nothing. Not bitterness. Bitterness would have meant carrying her with me, and I'd set that down a long time ago. Because here is what I finally understood. The night Claire folded her clothes into that suitcase, she believed she was seizing control of her life. She believed she was choosing something better, something more exciting, walking toward a future she deserved. What she never grasped was that choices don't come with punishments. They come with consequences, and the two are not the same. A punishment is something done to you. A consequence is simply the shape your own decision takes once it's out in the world. She chose the fantasy over the trust, the excitement over the man who'd quietly paid down her debt and kept her secrets and stood beside her when standing there actually cost something. And in time, the consequence of that choice arrived, unhurried and total, exactly the way I'd told her it would. And I learned something too, sitting in my driveway that night with the engine ticking as it cooled. Strength was never the loud thing. It wasn't the shouting or the revenge or the desperate begging for someone to stay who had already, in her heart, packed her bags months before her hands ever touched the suitcase. Strength was being prepared to walk away the moment respect was gone. It was protecting your own future instead of chasing a person who'd already left it. Claire thought she was ending my life when she left me for Brett. What she actually did was hand me a new one. And the calm sentence that made her freeze in that bedroom turned out to be the truest thing I ever said to her. She didn't lose everything the night she walked away. She only lost the one thing she'd never once imagined she'd have to replace. A man who had been loyal to her back when loyalty still meant something. And once that was gone, there was simply no getting it back.